Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Welcome to the webinar Compost Happens, Managing Food Safety Risks in Biological Soil Amendments. My name is Ariel Agenbroad. I am an educator with the University of Idaho Extension, and I am part of a great team of educators, faculty members, and specialists from 4 universities: University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, the Cooperative Extension Service of University of Alaska Fairbanks, and Oregon State University. And we are partners on a project trying to reach small farmers and hard to reach producers with information about the Produce Safety or the Food Safety and Modernization Act, and especially with regard to how it might affect their operations. So we will go ahead and get started. And I am hosting and presenting, so please forgive me if we have any momentary technological delays. I'm figuring all this out. Really glad that you could join us for this webinar today. Just a reminder, it will be recorded and you can view it again later or share it with other producers, clientele, or people that you know and work with. Just some tips for making the webinar run more smoothly for you today. If you are having issues, there are a few things that you can try. You can close all other programs that are running on your computer, especially internet browsers or emails that are using bandwidth. Check your sound. If you're having continual problems, then they are probably happening on your end. You might want to switch to the actual call-in number that would have come in your welcome email. If you have questions for me throughout the presentation, type them into the question box and I will review them at the end of the webinar and make sure that you get your questions answered. I'll also share with you how to get a hold of us later if you have questions that you'd rather type in via email. And we will be sending out handouts that complement or were mentioned in this presentation. And just to remind you too that we have had several webinars in this series, and we'll let you know where those are in case you want to view the whole batch of them. So something that you may have heard bandied around, you might know a lot about it, you might know a little bit about it, it might be something new to you altogether, and that's FSMA or FSMA. What are we talking about when we say this? If you've been on other of our webinars in this series, you've heard this already and might be starting to get tired of it. But if it's new to you, the Food Safety and Modernization Act, or FSMA for short, was signed into law on January 4th, 2011. This is the first sweeping food safety rule change in a very, very long time, and it's the first one to give the Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate food from farm to fork. And its goal is to establish science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh fruits and vegetables. It's trying to take a proactive approach to managing food safety illness outbreaks by identifying the sources of contamination and the pathways for contamination, so that we can have safer food from farm to fork. The Produce Safety Rule is just one of 7 rules in FSMA, and it's one that especially pertains to food production, processing, transportation, and importation. Actually, all those rules, the rules cover all of those different things. So the Produce Safety Rule particularly covers food production on farm. Some of the other rules that may or may not apply to you in your organization or operation would be preventative controls for human food. This is any processed food, and we have a few webinars in this series that are addressing this side of things. Preventative controls for animal food, the sanitary transportation of human and animal food, and then some other rules dealing with adulteration of food and also imports. The Produce Safety Rule, will it affect you or not? So several factors have to be considered to know where you fall under the compliance for the rule. If you're going to be trying to determine this for yourself, the things that you need to know are the types of produce you grow, your average annual gross sales of produce, how much total food you sell from your company, your farm, the percentage sold directly to a qualified end user. So these are individuals or families, say farmers market customers or CSA customers, restaurants, local grocery stores, or retail food stores. And we have created an online decision tool. It's for Idaho, but it will work for anybody to take this. And we are in the process of developing one that is going to not be just specific to Idaho with some of the answers that it gives you. But if you follow this QR code, or we can send you the link via email, this will let you go through a series of anonymous questions to determine whether you meet the minimums. Typically, if a farm is selling less than $25,000 a year of produce or food, they're not going to be covered by the rule. If they sell more than that, but less than 500,000, and they're selling more than half of their products to one of these qualified end users, so individual sales, a farm stand, a restaurant, or a co-op or grocery store, then they will be qualified for what's called a qualified exemption. And we discuss that in more detail in some of the other presentations and talk about what that requires and some of the record keeping that goes along with this. So if it turns out that you're not covered, why are you here? Why are you learning about this? Why should you be concerned? Well, it's true that many small farms are not going to be required to comply with all of the new rules. However, all farms are responsible for producing, packing, transporting, and selling safe food to their customers. And how the rule will affect you and your farm will eventually depend on what you grow, how much you sell, and who your customers are. But the other thing to remember is that even if you are very small, or even if you qualify for an exemption, if something were to happen where a foodborne illness was traced back to your farm, you in essence forfeit your right to be exempt, and you will have to start going through inspections and complying with all parts of the rule. So it's really good to know now what is required in the rule, and just to be prepared. So where do you start? It can be really overwhelming, especially if you are new to food safety or you haven't done a lot of it on your farm in the past. So first, know where you fit into the picture. Are you covered or exempt? And like I said, one of our introductory webinars goes into that in a lot more detail and guides you through those decision-making tools that help you figure that out. Once you know whether you're covered, not covered, or exempt, then understand the records that you need to keep in order to document and prove your exemption. And then third, realize that learning about all the practices outlined in the rule will potentially reduce the risk of produce contamination on farms of any size. And so almost every farm can make small changes, or sometimes large changes, to improve their food safety practices and become more effective at keeping customers safe. And I know that all farms want to produce the best food they possibly can. It's very important to us. So one of the sections of the Produce Safety Rule deals particularly with soil amendments of biological origin and human waste. And so it talks about using all the different kinds of soil amendments that may come from animals. And it also talks about using human waste, which we will get to in a minute. It pretty much determines that you should not use human waste in any of your food production. But many of us are using products of animal origin, and this includes manures, manure teas, biological amendments that may be derivative from animals, and compost teas. And I just noticed a spelling error there that I will fix. So why should we be concerned about soil amendments of biological or animal origin? Well, and that's because animal manures often contain bacteria, viruses, or parasites that can potentially make people very sick. And it can make people sick if it's used in some of the following ways. If it's used as a soil amendment in its raw state, and in contact with the edible portion of a growing crop and remains there until it's consumed. It can become a problem if it contaminates worker hands, clothes, shoes, equipment, tools, or other fresh produce, either inadvertently or coming in contact with it. Also, if it's stored in a way that allows for leaching, drift, or runoff, or possible contamination. We're going to look at all of these in a little bit more detail as we go through this presentation. So what are your risks on farms? So these are some questions that we ask producers when we're giving them a Produce Safety Alliance training. And you'll see down at the bottom, I've cited the Produce Safety Alliance for this list of questions because it's a really good one. And we use this with farms of all sizes to help them determine if they do have some things that might be risky, or to look at where there's room for improvement. So what kind of soil amendments do you use on your farm? Are you using raw manure, composted manure? Do you only use chemical inputs? What crops are receiving these soil amendments? So is it your fresh produce, or is it just your field crops or your agronomic crops? When do you apply these products? Do you apply them pre-harvest, during the growing season? At what time? And how do you apply them? Are they incorporated into the soil? Are they injected? Are they applied as a top dressing? Do you use them in potting mixes? And how much or how often do you apply them? And we all know that excessive application, especially of nitrogen and phosphorus materials, can lead to environmental impacts. So all of these things should be something that you take a look at when you're determining if you have risks about using animal origin products on your farm. So many small farms are integrated with crops and livestock, and this is really important for a number of reasons. It's healthy for a number of reasons, and profitable also for many reasons. So you may raise beef cattle, sheep, pigs. You might have poultry or a poultry operation, or eggs. So all of these animals are going to be producing manure, lots of it typically. What do you do with it? How do you incorporate it safely into a farm where you're also growing fresh produce? Well, I want to be very clear that the Produce Safety Rule and FSMA in general does not prohibit the use of animal products. It recognizes that manure is a really good thing. And if you're a small farmer that's using manures in your production system, then you know this too. That's increasing our soil tilth, the fertility and water holding capacity, especially on sandy soils or poor soils, and also on clay soils too, loosening them up. It turns waste into a valuable resource when you are doing both on your farm, or when you are only growing produce but you have neighbors that are livestock farms, and it builds that relationship. And again, it turns a waste product into a valuable resource. And it's widely available and cost effective as a source of nitrogen and phosphorus and as soil amendment. But manure can also not be a good thing. And like we talked about before, all manures can carry human pathogens. And if used incorrectly or at the wrong times or in the wrong way, they can lead to people getting very sick and even dying. And some animals tend to be reservoirs for certain types of pathogen. For example, cattle tend to carry things like E. coli and listeria in their manures more frequently, while chickens tend to have a higher levels of salmonella in their waste. So just knowing some of the different risks that come along with some of the different animal species. And many things can impact how that animal is shedding those pathogens in their manure. It can be their age, it can be the season, it can be the type of diet that they have. And so it's hard to know exactly when and where the risk is going to be highest. So it's really best to just treat all raw manures as a potentially risky substance and to manage it in the right way. So what are some of those right ways? We're going to talk about these in more detail, and I even have some videos lined up to show you to go into some of these a little bit more. But first thing that you can do is really take a look at your farm. How do you produce manure? How is manure being produced on your farm? What are you doing with it? How are you storing it when it's in its raw state? Are you composting it? Are you piling it up? Are you moving it around the farm? All these things are going to have an impact on potential food safety. Where you store it, how you move it, how you cover it, or how you protect it. It might be a good idea even to map the transport and storage of raw manures, especially if you are not the one that does all of this yourself. So how are the manures being cleaned out of animal areas? Where are they being taken to? How are they being managed in that storage place? And then what happens to the equipment and tools that are used in that transport and storage? And are they used in other activities on the farm? Most small farms do not have the luxury of having one tractor that is just for turning compost and moving manure and one that is for everything else. So in that case, you have to be even more vigilant about the cleaning and the maintenance of those equipment and tools. So do not apply raw manures or manure teas to growing crops. This is the simplest and easiest way to avoid contamination by the pathogens in raw manures to fresh produce, especially the fresh produce that is commonly consumed raw by consumers. And I should have mentioned before that these are the crops that are targeted in the Produce Safety Rule. So all crops that are commonly consumed raw, and that really includes most of our fresh produce. You can protect raw manures from leaching, runoff, drift, and accidental transport by your equipment, tools, clothing, and hands. So this is another one that not all farms give a lot of attention to, is in how those manures are really being managed on farm, especially if you don't feel like you have a lot of manure, it's just one pile. But that one pile could still have major impacts were it to leach, runoff, or drift onto produce. And then again, there's that human element of moving pathogens around by our equipment, tools, clothing, and hands. So a really great resource that we have used over the years in teaching food safety on farm is this material made by Cornell as part of their food safety on farm program. This handbook is available online, free to download, and we will link to it. And this is the grower self-assessment of food safety risks. So this is a set of tables and supporting resources that help a grower to look at their situation and identify maybe where they are in this continuum. Are they really following these best practices, or do they need to make some improvements along the way? And so here's just an example. Something that we tend to do is side dress crops, right? So in an ideal situation, you're not using any manure to side dress the produce crop in the field. And if you are using manure to side dress produce crops during the growing season, then we definitely need to change that and make that improvement so that we are not using manure in that way. Also, if you're thinking about using what you're going to plant in an area that was just recently treated with fresh manure, you could see that on the bottom of the spectrum, if you're planting lettuce and root crops directly in recently manured ground, this is something that's going to need some improvement because those are the edible portions of the crop and they're coming in contact with raw manure. And so you can see that continuum. Something that a little bit better but still needs some work would be that you're doing low-growing fruit or vegetable crops without mulch on recently manured ground. Again, there's still that risk for that manure to come in contact with the produce. So say you're planting things like tomatoes or peppers and you're staking them and your rows are covered with mulch. That is going to reduce the risk of contamination from manure in soil, but it is still not ideal. And if you were to be covered by the Produce Safety Rule in FSMA, this would not be an appropriate use of fresh manure. So the best practice in ground that has been treated with fresh manure would be that only tree fruits, fruit bushes, field or forage crops, or vegetable crops that will be heat processed, so maybe you only grow tomatoes for tomato sauce, that these would be planted on recently manured land and nothing else would be. So again, we will send out the link to these charts. They're really beneficial when you're trying to really look at, well, this is what I do. Is this a problem, or am I doing the right thing? So here's another sheet from the same booklet. This one talks a little bit about your manure sources and your application processes. So again, this one would trying to avoid that manure runoff, right? If your produce is regularly grown in fields that receive manure runoff from other fields or barnyards, that's definitely something that would need to change. The best practice would be that produce is never grown in fields that might receive manure runoff from other fields or barnyards. And in a small farm, especially in a more densely populated area, you may need to be looking at what your neighbors are doing as well as what you're doing. And then, so this is just some other information here. And then this one down at the bottom of that record keeping of manure use. So it's not required that you keep manure records, especially if you are not going to be covered by the rule, but it might really help you, especially if you want to document that you are allowing the recommended amount of time between manure application and planting. And we'll get to that in just a second too. So what about some of our other animal products? Maybe we're using bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, fish emulsion, especially if we're a certified organic farm, we are probably relying pretty heavily on some of these animal products. Well, the good news is that most of these commercial products will have already been processed in a way that makes them appropriate for use at any time in a produce farm. But if you are looking at some of these and maybe they're not from a commercial source, they need to be processed in a manner that's going to eliminate those pathogens. So what about composting and access to other forms of materials? So not just animal products, or maybe you don't have any animals on your farm and you don't use any manures in your composts. So maybe you just have access to a lot of cull fruits, maybe you have access to yard waste or municipal waste, and this is what you're using to create your soil amendments. Well, the good news is that these materials can be composted and make a very high quality compost, and they're not going to fall under the same restrictions as using animal manure. So like I said, this could be food waste, yard waste, cull vegetables. However, keep in mind that they aren't considered to be zero risk, because there's still a chance that they could contain chemical hazards, physical hazards, like actual pieces of metal or other things like that. And there still could be biological hazards in those materials. But composting them and using them do not come under the same restrictions as when you're using animal manure. So let's talk about composting. And let's talk about composting, especially when we are using animal manures as one of the key base products in our composting. You may compost on a pretty large scale because you may have a lot of animal products. You might compost on a much smaller scale. You might have some manures and then a lot of garden waste, especially if you are primarily a produce farmer. So let's talk about this a little bit. Oh, and you may even be doing very small or micro scale composting using worms. When we talk about compost, the Produce Safety Rule puts animal waste compost and animal manures into one of two groups. We either have treated, which this is materials that have been composted using a documented, scientifically valid method, and we have untreated, which is really anything else, including treated compost that somehow became contaminated again. So treated and untreated. And in order to clarify this a little bit, I'll go over a few examples, and then we've got a video that I'm going to show you. It's about a 5-minute video, and that'll mix it up a little bit. So examples of untreated soil amendments. So these are materials that would need to be composted in that valid, scientifically validated method before they could be considered treated. So this would be raw manure, any aged or stacked manure, right? So just putting the manure away for a couple years does not turn it into a safe product in terms of food safety rule. Untreated manure slurries, untreated manure teas, any agricultural teas with supplemental microbial nutrients in them, and again, any soil amendment, even if it was commercial compost, that has been mixed with raw manure. So I'm going to bring up this video because I think it's going to share a little bit more in detail the difference between treated and untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin. And I really like this video. I've met these guys from Michigan and they really know what they're talking about, so I think it's going to be a good one. So give me just a minute while I make the transition.
Hello, my name is Charles Gould and I'm with Michigan State University Extension. In this video, I'm going to discuss how the Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule, approaches and regulates treated versus untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin. We will cover the difference between treated and untreated animal-based soil amendments and how they should be handled and stored to minimize food safety risks. Here is how the Produce Safety Rule defines treated soil amendments of animal origin. According to the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, a biological soil amendment of animal origin is considered treated if it has gone through a complete process to adequately reduce microorganisms of concern. As you'll notice, the definition refers to section 112.54 of the rule. In this section, the law outlines two acceptable compost production methods that have been scientifically validated. The video entitled Safe and Successful Composting under FSMA takes a detailed look at both of these scientifically valid composting options. If you choose to use a different treatment method, you'll have to collect documentation to prove that it is a scientifically valid method. Untreated soil amendments, such as raw manure, have not gone through an appropriate process to kill any potential pathogens such as Salmonella or E. coli. Due to this, untreated soil amendments can pose a significant food safety hazard to fresh produce. The Produce Safety Rule states that growers must handle, convey, and store soil amendments so that they do not become a potential source of contamination to harvestable portions of produce. Treated soil amendments should be handled and stored in a way that minimizes risk of recontamination from untreated soil amendments. This may look like designating different equipment, clothing, gloves, and boots for handling treated versus untreated amendments, or washing and sanitizing equipment and changing clothing, boots, and gloves between uses. It also involves storing treated amendments in an area where they will not be recontaminated by foot traffic, wind, or other factors. However, if treated soil amendments come in contact with untreated soil amendments, such as raw manure, agricultural tea made with raw manure, or an amendment of unknown treatment status, they must be handled as if they were untreated or raw. This means maximizing the amount of time between application of the soil amendment and harvest, cleaning and sanitizing equipment or using designated equipment, changing clothing, boots, and gloves before moving on to other tasks, and washing hands.
Essentially, if it's a problem, we'll just treat it as a raw product and do fall application. If there's any question on any of the piles that we have, we just do fall application, which allows us to have, at least currently, the timeline that we need for raw materials. And so, yeah, if they get into, say, this side and this pile is exposed, if they get over there, then any of those two, but it was contained to one section.
Static and turned composting are two validated treatment options for soil amendments, covered in section 112.54 and detailed in the video entitled Safe and Successful Composting under FSMA. Other treatment methods are allowed as long as they are scientifically valid, controlled processes that achieve the microbial standards outlined in section 112.55. To ensure the adequate treatment of soil amendments, process monitoring and record keeping must be documented according to section 112.60. If there is no record of treatment, a soil amendment must be considered untreated and managed as if it were contaminated. You can refer to the video entitled FSMA Record Keeping Requirements for Biological Soil Amendments of Animal Origin to learn more about which records you need to keep in order to be in compliance with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. In summary, the use of biological soil amendments of animal origin can be risky. However, if the amendments are treated properly, as well as handled and stored in a way to reduce cross-contamination, the risk of a foodborne illness can be minimized, and soil amendments can be extremely valuable to soil fertility.
All right, we're back. Hope you enjoyed that little brief video. So why would it matter? Oh, and I also wanted to mention, they did talk about record keeping in there. And if it turns out that you are above the sales minimums and you're going to have to be compliant with the rule, yes, there are some specific records that you need to keep related to your soil amendments. If you are small enough or you qualify for an exemption, you don't have to keep the records about how you use your soil amendments. But it's a good idea to at least keep some records as to where your amendments are coming from, how they're being composted, and how you're handling them, just so that you are knowing that you're doing whatever is safest on your farm. So as we're going through that video, you may have had some questions. Why would I want my compost to qualify as treated? What does that really mean? What is the benefit to me by going through that process or having that process happen? Well, the nice thing about a treated compost, if it qualifies as treated compost, the rule allows for a 0-day application window, which means that you can apply it at any time during the growing season, even the same day that you're going to harvest. You can apply it directly to edible crops, on them, around them, in the soil that they're growing in. You can use it in potting mixes and other applications where you're growing seedlings or you're starting your plants. Many small farmers use compost routinely as a side dressing or a top dressing, as a mulch, as a way to give our small young plants a boost and also to maintain that growth and that soil health throughout the year. So it's really nice to have that flexibility that you can use your compost at any time of the growing season and you're not limited. And especially as an organic grower, you don't necessarily have as many fertility options, and compost is usually really high on the list. What if you buy all your compost? Well, in most cases, if you're a small grower, you're not covered by the rule. That's fine. Most of our commercial composts are being processed in an appropriate way. However, sometimes it really is helpful to ask the compost processor what method they are using and if they keep records of the time and temperature and the production of that compost. And if they're keeping those records, is this something that they can provide you with? Some compost companies will even go to the extent of having their compost analyzed and getting basically a soil test report back for your compost so that you know the percentages of nutrient, you know the salt levels, you know the organic matter content. This could be very beneficial too, just for your agronomic knowledge and record keeping. So ask about this. And if you are a covered farm, if you are compliant with the rule, you do need to keep these records from your commercial composter so that you can ensure that the compost that you're buying does qualify as one of those treated amendments. And again, if you are not exempt from the rule, you do need to keep these records. If you are exempt from the rule, you do not need to keep these records, but it might not be a bad idea just to tuck those into your food safety plan and have them on hand. If anything were to go wrong, you want to be able to rule out that, that certain things were to blame. So what if you don't have the time, equipment, or expertise to compost, and what if commercially produced compost is not available to you? Well, then you just consider all of your biological soil amendments to be in that untreated category. Even if that manure has been sitting there for 6 years, it has not been composted, it's still considered untreated. And in these cases, then the rule allows you to follow the recommendations for applying raw manure that conform to the National Organic Standard. Currently, the Food and Drug Administration is doing their own research on what would be an appropriate interval time for the application of raw manure to food crops. But right now, what they're saying is that if you use the rule or the practices recommended by the National Organic Standard, then you will be in compliance. And this is that you don't apply raw manure any earlier than 120 days prior to the first harvest or the harvest of a product whose edible portion directly contacts the soil surface or soil particles, and that you apply it 90 days prior to the harvest of a product whose edible portion does not have direct contact with the soil surface. So this would be 120 days for anything that grows on the ground, for any root crops, for any low growing or vining crops, and then 90 days prior to harvest for any fruits or vegetables that are growing above ground and not coming in direct contact with the soil surface. Of course, there's always the potential for rain splashing and all of these things that can bring those particles in contact with produce, and that's part of the reason that we observe these intervals. So you changed your mind. You want to be able to compost. You want to be able to apply that compost at any point throughout the growing season. All right, so there are two different scientifically valid processes that are recognized by FDA. And again, a small farm, you're not going to have to keep these records and prove these processes, But if anything were to happen, it would be really nice to be able to assert that your compost met these requirements. And also, you're going to be creating the best possible product if you're following these guidelines. Your compost is going to be safe. It is not going to have the pathogen load. And as another added bonus, you're probably going to be doing away with a lot of your weed seeds as well in this type of situation. So the two scientifically valid processes that are allowed by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule would be aerated static composting, that is aerobic, where you're reaching a minimum of 131 degrees for 3 days, followed by curing with proper management to assure that those elevated temperatures are going throughout all the materials in that compost. So this is a compost that you do not turn, rather you force air into it or you have it aerated. And we're going to watch another video that really goes into this in more depth. The other would be turned composting. And this is also aerobic, minimum of 131 degrees for 15 days, a minimum of 5 turnings followed by curing. So these are pretty standard recommendations for making compost, though it does take some time and attention and record keeping, and it may take some equipment up front for the aerated static composting and equipment for the turned composting. Now, there may be other scientifically valid controlled composting processes. At University of Idaho, we have a composting specialist. You may at your land-grant university, but you can always reach out to us and we can help you identify some other methods that might comply with this and how you would keep those records. So we're going to switch over to the video again. This one is about 8 minutes. This is the last one, and then we will discuss what we've seen in the video a little bit more. So hang on with me while I make the switch again. And I just shared my own screen again. Hold on, I'm going to get there, I promise. All right, here we go.
Hello, my name is Charles Gould, and I'm with Michigan State University Extension. In this video, we're going to discuss scientifically valid and controlled composting methods that are allowable under the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. When it comes to composting, microorganisms are our friends. But we know that some microorganisms like E. coli and Salmonella can be dangerous if they get into our food supply. Therefore, the goal of this video is to demonstrate how to safely compost and how to avoid cross-contamination when handling and storing biological soil amendments of animal origin. What the Produce Safety Rule means when it states scientifically valid composting methods is that researchers have performed repeated testing on standardized, science-based composting practices, and the results of that testing have consistently shown a reduction of harmful microorganisms. This means that when a farm follows the methods as specified, the finished compost will be considered treated. In other words, the harmful microbes will be adequately killed off. Let's go over the basic details of safe composting. A safe and effective compost pile begins with appropriately siting the pile. Ideally, the compost pile should be a minimum of 50 feet from wells, streams, and other water sources. The floor of the compost pile should be greater than 2 feet above the water table, and the pile should be located in an area that is well drained away from floodplains. Since manures carry and spread human pathogens, it is important to make sure it doesn't contaminate any water sources, therefore presenting a food safety risk to the farm or the surrounding area. Additionally, the manure storage and treatment site should be situated as far as practical from fresh produce production and handling areas. Consider barriers or physical containment to avoid runoff, leaching, animal, foot, or equipment traffic, or wind spread of that matter. Second, there are 3 key management parameters during the 4 stages of composting. Each stage of composting has a unique time and temperature indicator and microbial activity level. Stage 1 occurs approximately the first to second day after the compost pile is constructed. The temperature of the pile starts at ambient air temperature, but begins to increase as microbial activity increases. At this stage, the microorganisms in the pile are beginning to break down the organic matter. Stage 2 is from the third to the fifth day. The pile temperature should be between 100 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Microbial counts are very high, and so is the organic matter decomposition rate.
A lot of steam coming off. This would suggest that we've got a lot of good biological activity going on here. We're at 130 degrees. Looks like we've got plenty of moisture here. In fact, let's do the moisture test. Let me grab a handful of this material. What I'm going to do is squeeze it in my hand, and I'm going to look to see if there's any moisture that comes out. I open it up. The compost stays together in a form. I have a kind of a sheen of moisture on my hands. This is the right moisture level for what we want to, the right moisture level for good compost production. So this compost pile, this 4-day-old compost pile, is at 137, 136, something along those lines, which is sufficient for pathogen kill. That's exactly what we're looking for.
At this stage, oxygen and moisture levels are typically depleted, and so the pile needs to be turned. Stage 3 is day 6 and beyond. The temperature of the pile is somewhere between 110 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Organic matter is breaking down fast, and the volume of the pile decreases by 50 to 60%. It is very common to see steam coming out from the pile at this point. When temperatures reach 160 degrees Fahrenheit in the compost pile, it causes microbial activity to cease. Stage 4 is also commonly known as the curing stage, and it can last for up to a year. The compost temperature drops back to ambient temperature during this stage. If we were to test the compost at the end of the curing stage, we will find that the harmful bacteria such as E. coli and Salmonella is at a very low level, which means very low produce safety risk. A static compost pile is not just a stacked pile of organic matter. Key to making compost is airflow. Ensuring this airflow in a static pile requires a bit of thought. Static piles have some ways to ensure the air is delivered to the center of the pile. Two common ways this can be achieved is by using large PVC pipes with holes drilled in them, or by using layers of straw that allow air to flow through the layers. In any case, static compost requires air to be distributed in some way to the center of the pile. For those using the turned or aerated composting method, the third management parameter to be aware of is the turning of the pile. Turning the pile incorporates oxygen, which allows aerobic microorganisms to flourish and keeps a uniform temperature throughout the pile. Most importantly, it generates high enough temperatures to kill pathogens and weed seeds. When compost is ready for use, it smells earthy and looks like a soil.
Nice color.
Nice earthy smell. Very nice. And that's the way compost is supposed to, the end product is supposed to have that nice earthy smell to it. It has a very, very nice smell to it. When you put it in your hand, it should crumble easily and will not have any identifiable items such as wood shavings or leaves.
And if I take a handful of it, it retains its shape. It's holding water. That's exactly what you want with compost.
This is completely finished. So if I put my probe in, there should be no temperature reading. If it heats up, then something's wrong. The FSMA Produce Safety Rule outlines two separate time and temperature regimes to make acceptable compost. The first regime is a static pile that must reach at least 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive days. The second regime is an active or turned compost pile that reaches at least 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 non-consecutive days. The Produce Safety Rule requires at least 5 turns during the period where the temperature and time requirements are being met. Time and temperature records are essential in proving that your compost was made properly and met the scientifically validated methods suggested by the Produce Safety Rule. Remember, if it wasn't recorded, it never happened. Biological soil amendments created, treated, and recorded according to the FSMA Produce Safety Rule may take a bit more time and effort, but the result is that you can be assured in the knowledge that the amendment being applied is low risk.
All right, so hope you enjoyed that other very thrilling video. We can certainly connect you with more resources about the difference between those two methods, the churned and the static. And that really gives me an idea that maybe we need to work on some more publications for small farms on really effective composting, because it very much is an art and a science. So now we've made that perfectly beautiful compost. We've checked all the boxes. It's been made correctly. Now let's talk a little bit about storing your compost and your manures. They mentioned this briefly in both of those videos, but I want to go over it one more time because you can't always start your compost until you have enough of some of these materials. And so typically there's a storage phase, and then there's the composting phase, and then there's what to do with the compost once it's finished. So number one, whether you're storing raw manures or finished compost, you want to minimize runoff, leaching, and wind drift because that's going to reduce your contamination of crops, water sources, and the handling areas where you might be working with fresh produce. Do not store any of these materials in locations that are likely to experience runoff or in areas that are close to water sources, particularly water sources, because manures are going to be high in nitrogen and phosphorus. Keep raw manures and finished compost in separate areas so they don't cross-contaminate, because you saw in both of those videos that when raw manure contaminates finished compost, then it turns that finished compost into an untreated material again, and it undoes all that hard work. And then try to minimize animal access to compost piles. So this may mean that you have to cover them, you may have to create a little berm around them, whatever you need to do to try to maintain this in both of your manure and compost storage areas. And a little bit about safe handling, right? If possible, designate specific equipment and tools for handling soil amendments. And this would also be true for handling raw manure versus the finished compost. If that is not possible, because you only have one tractor or you only have a few shovels, then develop some procedures where you identify when and how to clean and sanitize your equipment and tools, especially the ones that are coming in contact with soil amendments and then potentially fresh produce. So if you're using the same equipment to clean out the barns and haul the manure over to the storage site, and then you're using that same equipment to turn your compost pile, and then again to take that compost out to the field where you have your fresh produce growing, you might want to think about some steps in the intermediary times where that can be cleaned and sanitized appropriately. And then thinking too about feet, equipment, and tools. You saw in the video, in one of them, I think they showed his feet, and he was wearing those little blue booties. So really think about the fact that you may be tramping materials around even if you don't mean to. So look at how you might make those changes too. So it looks like we're going to be maybe done a little bit early, which is good. We'll have some time for questions. But let's summarize. So reducing the risk on your farm from those biological soil amendments of animal origin. So number one, do not apply raw manures to growing produce crops. So if you are only having access to raw manure, then think about those 120 or 90-day intervals between application and harvest of a fresh produce crop. And it's best just to avoid applying raw manures to the growing crops altogether. Again, if you use raw manures, allow that time interval of 90 to 120 days between application and harvest. And if you're going to be composting, use a scientifically valid method of composting to treat your raw manures and to make them safe for use on your crops. And then carefully store, manage, and transport your raw and treated soil amendments separately, and avoid any kind of cross-contamination, whether it's through equipment, tools, supplies, or your own hands, feet, and clothing. So to let you know a little bit more about the other resources related to this project and some other webinars that you might be interested in, for a list of upcoming webinars for all types of small farm topics, visit www.cultivatingsuccess.org. And then also we do have some information on general food safety resources through our University of Idaho Extension webpage. And then a webpage that I wanted to tell you about that I don't think I have listed on this slide is pnwfoodsafety.org. And that is the website that's been created for this project. And since we have a little bit of time, I'm going to show you that page really quick. So give me just a second. I'm going to take off this screen for a minute. And I'm going to pull up that page because I think that I would like for you to see it. All right, so I think you can see this now. So this is the website that has been developed for that multi-state project. And you can see it's covering not only produce safety, but also food products. And it goes much more into depth into what is FSMA. And again, it's a project of these 4 universities, and it's funded by the USDA and NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And so on this, you can go to webinars, and you can see all the different webinars that we have already played or that are coming up. You can download the complete schedule. You can look at what's coming. And then if you've missed it, you can go back and you can watch the recording. So for instance, I referenced the introduction to the Produce Safety Rule a couple times. You can go on and watch that recording. And then also our presentations around the Produce Safety Rule and the Preventative Controls for Human Food Rule. So just wanted to let you know that that is there. You can also use this website to request a USB drive with all of the webinars recorded onto it. And then if you're coming to visit us from another state, we do have resources listed for Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And we really encourage you to click on there and look at what's being offered in your state. For example, Washington has a whole lot of resources around produce safety, consumer food safety, and food processing. And then you can contact any of your local experts in these states through this website as well. So I encourage you to take the opportunity. It's www.pnwfoodsafety.org is the website. Oops, I think, oh, and this is the last one. So the last thing is that we're going to send out a post-webinar evaluation to you all. We'd love it if you would fill it out and give us some hints on what you liked about the webinars, what could be improved, and also for future topics, because we really keep these webinars going year-round, and we'd like to know how to really help you be successful through some of these educational formats. And then if you want to contact me directly with any questions about what you saw today or any of the other topics that I've covered in these webinars, you can email me at ariel@uidaho.edu. And I'm going to check and see if there have been any questions. And there have not been any questions submitted yet. I'll give you a second if you thought of anything that you'd like to ask that I can address on the webinar. I'll just give you a minute to type that in. All right, it doesn't look like there were any questions. I want to thank you all for spending your time to attend the webinar with us. We hope that you will attend more of them and that you will reach out to us if you need any help in your state or on your farm. So Thank you again, and have a lovely day.